Hello everyone, take a moment to enjoy this relaxing moments while you watch. A child who kept crying and pointing at the trash can, leaving her mother horrified upon discovery. Julia took a deep breath, her eyes locked onto her little daughter, Nora, who gleamed with rosy cheeks. Over 2 years old, Nora still retained the innocent expression of a little angel. Her giggles filled their cozy home daily with joy and energy. "Are you hungry, my love?" Julia gently bent down as Nora reached for a cookie from her hand. Nora nodded, but today her focus was not on her mother. She gazed out the window toward the large trash bin outside the old neighbor's house. The neighbors had left, abandoning the rusted, weathered metal bin behind. Julia instinctively followed her daughter's line of sight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just that large, faded trash can. "Nora, what do you see out there?" Julia asked, smiling and holding her daughter's hand. Nora didn't answer. She merely pointed at the trash bin, her face hinting at fear. Though her lips moved, no words emerged. Julia felt a slight surprise, but she thought perhaps Nora was just captivated by something new and fascinating. After all, children tend to be curious, she reassured herself, leaning down to comfort Nora. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's just a trash bin. Nothing to be afraid of." Nora remained silent, her eyes still glued to that large trash bin, wide with a peculiar fear, as if something dreadful lurked within. Julia felt a shiver run through her, but quickly scooped Nora up, turning away from the window. In the days that followed, Julia noticed that Nora was no longer as cheerful. Every time they passed that trash bin, Nora would shrink back, her face paling as if confronted with something frightful. Sometimes she would cling shyly to her mother, her big round eyes filled with fear, leaving Julia bewildered. "What's wrong, Nora? Is something there?" Julia inquired, hoping to uncover some answers. Nora only shook her head gently, her face betraying a timid fear. One evening, while Julia prepared dinner, Nora stood by the window once more, intently staring at the trash. "Ben." Julia approached quietly, bending down to ask softly, "Nora, what do you see there?" Nora whispered in a voice barely audible, the person in the darkness. Julia froze, startled, her heart racing suddenly. She turned to look out the window again, but saw nothing beyond the trash bin's shadowy outline and the nearby trees. Just another ordinary night. But the way Nora spoke sent chills down Julia's spine. "Someone in the darkness," Julia mused, frowning, her belief wavering. Unsure if Nora was fabricating tales or if she truly saw something, she grew increasingly uneasy when passing the neighbors' bin. Even though she told herself it was likely just Nora's imagination, an inexplicable worry loomed within her. "I promise you, my love, there's nothing out there. It's just the neighbor's old trash bin." "No need to be scared," Julia said gently, hoping to comfort both her daughter and herself. Yet Nora remained silent, burying her head in her mother's chest, searching for absolute safety. Julia observed, Nora feeling a strange sensation stir inside her. Nora was not a timid child, usually curious and eager to explore. But now, every time they neared that neighbor's trash bin, Nora would grow, so frightened that she refused to approach it. That night, after Nora fell asleep, Julia couldn't stop mulling over the recent events. Standing by the window, staring at the trash bin with a contemplative expression, even though it was merely a waste receptacle, Julia couldn't shake off the strange feeling escalating within her. The echoes of Nora's whispers regarding a person in darkness swirled in her mind, For a fleeting moment, Julia wondered if something truly terrifying was hidden within that darkness, or if it was simply a child's imagination. However, the longer she gazed, the more she felt an invisible presence lurking, waiting for someone to drop their guard. That night, Julia awoke from a hazy dream, where she walked through darkness, surrounded by rustling sounds and eerie whispers. Her legs trembled as she saw the trash bin looming before her, as if beckoning for her to approach. Julia's hands shook as the cold air seeped from inside the bin, mingling with an oppressive sense of suffocation. Sweating, she woke up with beads on her forehead, feeling anxious and uneasy, glancing at Nora, who lay peacefully beside her. The unsettling sensation only intensified when she thought of what Nora had said. Julia sighed, convincing herself. She was likely overthinking things, yet deep down, she knew it wasn't that straightforward. The next day, preparing to take Nora for their usual walk, Julia noticed a different expression on her daughter's face. Nora appeared hesitant about leaving the house, standing by the door, her eyes fixed on the trash bin outside, worry written all over her face. "Nora, come on, my love. Let's go to the park, okay?" Julia smiled, trying to generate a cheerful atmosphere to capture her daughter's attention. But Nora didn't budge, her face tense, as though confronted with something terrifying. A strong sense of concern gripped Julia, but she reassured herself that Nora was probably just tired. As they walked past the trash bin, a foul odor struck them hard, causing Julia to cover her nose. "Oh my, what a horrible smell!" She grimaced, glancing down at Nora, who merely looked silently at the trash bin, her expression haunted. "Nora, I don't understand what you see. You're making me really worried, sweetheart." Julia tried to comprehend, but Nora remained silent, her wide eyes signaling some unspeakable terror. When Julia drew close to the trash bin for a better look, she noticed faint bloodstains on the edges and the lid. A shiver ran down her spine, her heart racing as she turned back to her daughter. "Maybe someone accidentally threw something in here," Julia murmured to herself. She couldn't tear her gaze away from those small, unmistakable bloodstains. Quickly, she pulled Nora away from the area, trying to convince herself it was just an accident. Yet the unpleasant smell and the bloodstains haunted her for the rest of the day. As night fell, Julia got ready for bed, but the images of those stains and Nora's fearful expression persisted in her mind like a lingering shadow. She fell into a restless sleep, dreaming she was trapped in a cramped, dark space, feeling surrounded by invisible pressure from all sides. Despite her attempts to escape, freedom eluded her. Her own screams jolted Julia awake, beads of sweat covering her forehead, with the suffocating feeling lingering as a strange aftertaste. Looking over at Nora, peacefully sleeping next to her, Julia couldn't regain her own sense of peace. "Nora, what did you really see out there?" Julia whispered, worry filling her gaze. The next day, Julia began to pay closer attention to Nora's behavior. Each time they passed the trash bin, despite her efforts to divert Nora's attention with games and stories, Nora would fall silent, her eyes filled with haunting fear. One day, Julia encountered a nearby neighbor and could not resist discussing what troubled her. "Excuse me, do you know why the trash bin next door has been smelling so terrible?" Julia asked, lowering her voice as though not wanting anyone else to overhear. The neighbor wrinkled her brow, thinking for a moment before shaking her head. "I'm not sure either. Lately, that bin has seemed unusual. I heard strange noises at night, but I assumed it was just stray cats." Julia shivered but maintained her composure. offering a faint smile and thanking the neighbor as she headed home, unable to shake the haunting thought from her mind. That night, as Julia fell asleep, little Nora began to have strange dreams again. Julia woke suddenly to the sound of Nora whimpering in her sleep, gently shaking her daughter. When Nora opened her eyes, they were filled with fear. "Mom, Mummy, the person in the darkness," Nora exclaimed, her voice trembling. Julia froze, a chill running down her spine, gently stroking Nora's hair to soothe her. A storm of emotions brewed within Julia. "It's okay, my love. I'm here. Don't worry." Yet deep down, she realized she couldn't ignore this unease any longer. It felt as if something heavy overshadowed her family, haunting every moment they spent together in the days that followed. Julia noticed Nora growing more frightened each time they passed the trash bin. It was no longer just fearful glances. Nora would cling tightly to her mother, refusing to take even a single step near it. "Mummy, no, don't go that way," Nora stammered, tears filling her eyes. Julia felt confused but didn't press for more. Whatever was happening seemed too complicated for Nora to articulate. "All right, my love, let's take another route," Julia replied, trying to comfort her daughter while her mind drifted back to the strange occurrences surrounding that trash bin. Each night, Julia lay in bed thinking about the bloodstains, the foul smell, and Nora's words about the person in the darkness. She knew she had to act, yet the fear of what might lie behind those eerie signs made her hesitate. As Julia's mind raced in the darkness, she debated whether she should uncover the truth about that trash bin. It wasn't just Nora's fear that troubled Julia. She too was haunted by the images from her dreams. The following morning, as she took Nora out, Julia unexpectedly encountered an elderly woman sitting on a park bench not far from their home. The woman wore a worn coat, solitary, her tangled grey hair a telling sign of her struggles. Julia felt a strange familiarity, even if she couldn't recall ever meeting her before. "Hello there, do you live nearby?" Julia asked, attempting politeness. The woman stared at Julia for a long moment, her gaze sad yet piercingly cold. She nodded, then suddenly glanced toward the trash bin, speaking in a raspy voice. "It's still there, isn't it?" Taken aback by this odd question, Julia's curiosity compelled her to respond. "Do you mean the trash bin?" The woman faintly smiled, her expression mysterious. "Yes, that bin. It's not exactly what you think it is." Her gaze unfocused, as if lost in a distant memory, she added, "You know, sometimes what's inside isn't quite what it seems." Julia shuddered, unsure how to reply. Nora tightened her grip on her hand, sensing her mother's fear. "What do you mean, ma'am?" Julia asked, hoping to gain further insight. But the elderly woman merely shook her head, her eyes wandering off into the distance. "Don't get too close. Some things are best left alone. You understand?" Julia felt a mix of emotions building. Within her, she longed to grasp the meaning behind the woman's words, yet an unspoken fear held her back. When she turned to ask for more clarification, the elderly woman had already risen and walked away, leaving Julia with countless unanswered questions. Back home, Julia couldn't shake the memory of her peculiar conversation. That woman's words echoed ominously in her mind. "The person in the darkness," Julia whispered, a chill running down her spine. That evening, as she prepared Nora for bed, strange noises emerged from the direction of the trash bin. Cautiously, Julia pulled back the curtain, peering outside at the shadowy outline of the trash bin beneath the streetlight. Something flickered around it, but she didn't dare look long. Telling herself she was imagining things didn't quell the fear surging within her as a faint scratching sound emanating from inside the bin compelled her dread. "Nora, do you hear that?" Julia asked, her voice trembling. Nora nodded slightly, her eyes wide with terror, snuggling closer to her mother. "Mummy, it's there again," she whispered. At a loss for what to do, Julia held her daughter tightly, but realized she could no longer overlook Nora's fearful behavior. That night, as Julia spoke to her husband Peter, who had just returned from a long workday, she grasped his hand, looking into his calm, reassuring eyes. "Peter, have you ever noticed the neighbor's trash bin?" Julia began, striving to maintain her composure. Peter raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by his wife's unexpected question. "The trash bin, is there something special about it?" Julia hesitated, her worry apparent. "Nora has been terrified every time we pass by it, and I feel like something isn't right." Peter chuckled, but his smile faded quickly upon seeing the seriousness in Julia's expression. "Are you really that worried about a trash bin?" Julia nodded, her voice dropped to a whisper. "I know it sounds strange, but recently I've seen bloodstains around it, and it smells terrible. Today, I met an old woman who said something peculiar about the bin, as if there was something frightening inside it." Peter fell silent, skepticism flickering in his eyes, though he didn't want to further worry Julia. "I think you might just be tired. It's probably just stray cats leaving those marks." Julia nodded, trying to believe her husband's reassurances, yet deep inside she couldn't shake her unease. The next morning, as she took Nora for their usual outing, Julia noticed new scratch marks on the trash bin's lid, as if something inside were trying to escape. This time, Julia couldn't ignore it any longer. Nora clutched her mother's hand, her voice trembling. Mummy, don't go near it." Julia gazed down at her daughter, her heart racing wildly as each step brought them closer to the bin, a sense of terror consuming her. But Julia reassured herself, convincing herself it was merely imagination, that even as the bizarre signs haunted her, they were likely harmless. That night, when all grew quiet, Julia couldn't stop recapitulating the mysteries surrounding the trash bin. She gazed out the window, feeling as if something or someone watched her from that area, making it impossible to shut her eyes. Lately, Julia noticed something very strange. The area near the trash bin had no birds that sang or chirped. Everything felt eerily silent. As Julia pondered this, Peter entered from another room, observing her staring blankly outside. "Are you looking out there again?" Peter's voice was filled with concern, noting Julia's unusual behavior in recent days. "I feel like something's not right," Julia admitted, keeping her eyes fixed on the bin outside. Peter sighed, grasping her hand and gently pulling her away from the window. "My love, I think you need to rest more. Everything will be fine. There's nothing out there." Julia nodded, though deep down, she couldn't fully believe her husband's comforting words. Something dark lingered in that area. The following morning, Julia resolved to take Nora for a walk again, but right as they stepped outside, Nora froze, her eyes widening with fear as she looked toward the trash bin. Mummy, don't go there," Nora whispered, clutching her mother's hand tightly, tears starting to fill her eyes. Julia bent down, hugging Nora, trying to offer comfort, but the unease churned within her heart. To avoid distressing her daughter further, she opted for a different route, steering clear of the bin. At the nearby park, Julia bumped into some neighbors, feeling compelled to ask, "Has anyone noticed anything strange around the trash bin at the old neighbor's house?" An older man frowned, responding, "I've heard that a few cats have gone missing lately. Maybe they got into the bin and got stuck." A chill ran down Julia's spine upon hearing this. Missing cats. She endeavored to remain calm, continuing her conversation, but the weight of worry shadowed her. Back at home, Julia couldn't stop contemplating what she'd heard. That night, she planned to go outside to inspect the bin, determined to understand the truth of the situation. Under the cover of darkness, while everyone slept, Julia quietly opened the door and slipped out into the night stillness, the cold air wrapping around her as she cautiously approached the bin. The streetlight cast flickering shadows around it. Standing there, she listened to strange sounds emitting from within the bin, faint scratching noises as if some creature fought to escape. Terror engulfed her, and she instinctively stepped back, ready to flee, yet she calmed herself, rationalizing. It was just the wind or a trivial noise. The chilling fear was undeniable, however. The next morning, Julia couldn't shake her anxiety and approached an elderly neighbor named Carmen, knowing she had lived in the area for years and might possess insight about the bin's past. When Julia inquired about the trash bin, the woman remained silent for several moments before saying, "I think you shouldn't go near it. That trash bin has many stories tied to it." "What kind of stories?" Julia's curiosity flared, eager for more. Carmen responded slowly, "I don't know much, but people used to say a homeless man lived around here. He mysteriously disappeared. And since then, many claimed to hear strange noises from that bin." Julia felt a chill spread through her body, genuinely stunned. How could it be? Was there truly something terrifying inside the bin, or just a product of wild imaginations? Back home, Julia opted not to mention her suspicions to Peter, fearing he might think she was being overly sensitive. Yet she couldn't deny her feelings, especially since Nora wasn't easily swayed by mere fictional tales. The next day, as Julia took Nora out once more, she could not ignore the sheer terror in her daughter's demeanor whenever they approached the bin. This time, Nora burst into tears as they passed by, pushing Julia's patience to its limit. "Mommy, don't let it. Come near me. I'm scared." Julia held her daughter close, struggling to find comfort in her own words. "It's okay, Nora. Mummy will protect you. Everything will be all right." But deep down, Julia recognized a horrifying truth. Something was genuinely wrong with that trash bin, and she had to uncover the dark reality, no matter how terrifying it could be. That night, Julia lay awake, mulling over the tales Carmen shared, imagining the homeless man lurking in darkness and the strange noises emanating from the trash bin, forming a distressing connection that haunted her. In the days that followed, she noted Nora's fear intensifying. Not only would Nora avoid the trash bin, but even inside the house, strange sounds from outside would startle her, wide-eyed with terror. One morning, while preparing breakfast for Nora, Julia heard her daughter crying in the living room. Rushing out, she found Nora standing by the window, tear-streaked cheeks and trembling lips, her eyes fixated on the trash bin. "Mummy, don't let it come near me," Nora pleaded. Julia enveloped her daughter in a hug, desperately trying to soothe her while feeling the urgency rising within. She sat beside Nora, stroking her soft hair. "My love, what are you afraid of? Tell me, and I'll help you." Nora looked down, tears welling in her eyes, hesitating before whispering, "There's someone in there. A bad person, Mummy." A chill ran down Julia's spine, her own pulse quickening. The weight of Nora's words seemed to echo like an ominous alert. Julia's heart raced yet again. She wanted to comfort her daughter by dismissing it as an ordinary trash bin, but couldn't ignore the unsettling sense of dread enveloping her. That night, as Julia lay in bed, vivid thoughts about the trash bin containing dark shadows swirled in her mind. Those strange dreams and Nora's terror didn't seem to be a coincidence, almost as if a haunting presence enveloped her family, making sleep impossible in the dead of the night. The echoing sound of scratching reached her ears, emanating from the vicinity of the trash bin. The insistent, eerie scratching lingered, each beat echoing as though something inside yearned to break free. Julia shivered, mustering her courage to approach the window, glancing outside. Under the dim glow of the streetlight, she saw the trash bin, still and silent, but an unsettling rhythm persisted, preventing her from resting, unable to overcome the feeling of being haunted. Julia ultimately decided to go outside. As she stared at the trash bin, an overwhelming sensation of being pulled into its dark shadow absorbed her whole essence. The following morning, Julia decided she couldn't remain silent any longer. She contacted the police, reporting the strange sounds and unusual signs around the trash bin. However, the dispatcher reassured her that nighttime noises were common, suggesting they might be stray cats or lost animals. Disappointed, Julia resolved to dig deeper. She felt a hidden truth simmering and was determined to shield Nora from this inexplicable fear. That evening, sitting in the living room with Nora, dim light casting soft shadows, Nora suddenly turned to Julia, her eyes wide with worry. "Mum, don't leave me alone." Julia looked at her daughter, sadness a pang in her heart. "My love, I'm here. I'll always be by your side. There's nothing to fear." Yet deep down, Julia understood that her comforting words would soon ring hollow. She sensed that Nora genuinely feared something far beyond mere imagination. After Nora fell asleep, Julia stepped quietly onto the balcony, gazing over at the trash bin. This time, she knew she could hesitate no longer. Her fear had peaked, and it was time to uncover the truth behind the unsettling trash bin. Returning to her bedroom, Julia laid beside Nora, looking at her daughter's small face, vowing to not let fear consume her any longer. She resolved that tomorrow would be the day she confronted the truth. Despite its terror, awakening the next morning with fierce determination, Julia knew she couldn't endure this anxiety any longer. She would confront the trash bin and reveal the truth, regardless of how frightening it might be. Waiting until Nora was safely out playing with friends, Julia returned to face the bin, resolve overflowing in her eyes. Nothing could hinder her now. Stepping confidently toward the bin, her hands trembled yet remained resolute as she slowly lifted the lid. Julia's heart sank horrified at the sight within. An elderly woman lay frail and weak, immobile, visibly suffering, her face gaunt and her skin filthy, yet she still breathed, barely alive but holding on. Julia steadied herself and immediately called for emergency help. Crouching beside the woman, gently holding her cold, fragile hand. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm here to help." "Just hang on." The elderly woman slowly opened her eyes, whispering faintly, "Help me." Julia's heart ached as she met the woman's tortured gaze. No one deserved abandonment like this, and the sight fueled Julia's resolve to protect the elderly woman from whoever had left her in such a state. Shortly thereafter, the ambulance arrived, transporting the woman to the hospital. Julia didn't leave her side, riding along and gripping the frail hand tightly as an intense sadness welled within her, silently vowing to assist the elderly woman. While waiting outside the emergency room, Julia's heart raced, blending anxiety with empathy over the woman's condition. She pondered who could be cruel enough to abandon an elderly person in a trash bin. Eventually, a doctor emerged from the emergency room. "Are you the one who brought in the patient?" Julia nodded. "Yes, I found her." "How is she?" The doctor sighed, his expression somber. "She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and has multiple injuries. However, she's incredibly resilient, which might have contributed to her survival." Julia felt somewhat relieved, but her heart still ached. She sat by the elderly woman's bedside, waiting for her to awaken. After a while, the woman slowly opened her eyes, surveying her surroundings until they fell upon Julia. "Hello, ma'am, I'm Julia. Do you remember what happened?" The elderly woman nodded weakly, sadness reflecting in her eyes. "My name is Josephine. I've lived here a long time, but this is how it ends." Julia firmly grasped her hand, her voice layered with empathy. "Mrs. Josephine, I don't know what has happened, but I promise to do whatever I can to help you." Josephine's weary eyes glimmered with gratitude, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you. I think this is the first time in a long while that I feel someone truly cares." Listening to those words, Julia's heart felt heavy. Josephine explained that she had once hoped her son Adrian would care for her in her old age, yet his nature had changed. He became cold, cruel, and only interested in her assets. Abandoned and abused, Josephine had suffered terribly at the hands of her once loathing son. "Your son Adrian, how could he be so heartless?" Julia was unable to fathom the cruelty. "Is there anything you'd like me to do? You can't continue living like this." Tears filled Josephine's eyes as she reflected deep anguish. "I only want to live peacefully, without wealth or anything else. But Adrian won't let me have even that." Julia's heart surged with anger at such inhumanity. She resolved to help Josephine find the peace she craved. "Mrs. Josephine, I promise I won't allow anyone to hurt you again. I'll protect you." Josephine clasped Julia's hand, her eyes shimmering with newfound hope. "You are so kind. I don't know how to thank you." Julia smiled, feeling relief as she saw life rekindle in Josephine. "Just rest now and know you won't face anything alone anymore." They sat in silence, each sharing gratitude through their eyes. Julia understood the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to help Josephine seek justice and gain a peaceful, happy life. When Josephine's health improved slightly, Julia and her husband, Peter, decided to visit her in the hospital. As Julia recounted Josephine's story, Peter couldn't suppress his outrage. "You mean Adrian, her own son, left her in the trash bin?" His eyes filled with anger. Julia nodded, her voice low. She devoted her life to love and sacrifice for him, only to be met with abuse and neglect. "It's unbelievable." Peter squeezed Julia's hand. "We need to act. This can't continue." They entered the hospital room, where they spotted Josephine resting. Though she looked healthier, traces of exhaustion still lingered in her eyes. As she noticed Julia and Peter, Josephine managed a wary yet warm smile. "Mrs. Josephine, this is my husband, Peter," Julia introduced. "He also wants to help you." Peter approached, taking her hand sincerely. "Hello, Mrs. Josephine. You won't have to face this alone anymore. We're here to help you." Josephine gazed at Peter, tears glistening in her aged eyes. "Thank you both. I never thought anyone would care for me like this," Julia, filled with determination, stated, Mrs. Josephine, to seek justice and protect yourself, you must speak with the police. If you agree, we'll be by your side throughout this process. We want you to live in peace." Mrs. Josephine sat in silence, seemingly pondering Julia's words. Finally, she sighed and nodded slightly. "Perhaps it's time. I can't stay silent any longer. I'll cooperate with the police. I've been afraid for too long." Julia and Peter smiled, relieved with her decision. They called the police, and an officer arrived at the hospital to hear Mrs. Josephine's statement and understand her story. During the conversation, Mrs. Josephine recounted the entirety of her experience with Adrian, the son who had once been devoted but gradually turned cold, cruel, and greedy. "Adrian doesn't care about me at all. He just wants my assets. He wants to get rid of me to have full control," she said, trembling but bitter. The officer took meticulous notes, nodding sympathetically. "We will initiate an investigation into Adrian for abuse and neglect. We aim to protect your rights." Julia held the elderly woman's hand, reassuring her through her emotional turmoil. "Everything will be all right, Mrs. Josephine. We're here for you." After the police interview, Josephine turned to Julia and Peter, her eyes teeming with gratitude. "Thank you both. I don't know what I would have done without you. This is the first time in years I feel like I'm not alone." Peter held her hand warm and steady. "Mrs. Josephine, from now on, consider us your family. You won't endure anything alone, and your son will face the consequences of his actions." Mrs. Josephine smiled, tears flowing from her emotions. "Family? Do I really have a family now?" Julia gently patted her shoulder, affirming, "Yes, Mrs. Josephine, you have me, Peter, and even Nora. We all care about you." From that moment on, Julia and Peter were resolute in caring for Mrs. Josephine, ensuring she wouldn't face anything alone. They arranged for her to move in with them after being discharged, turning their home into a haven of comfort and peace for Josephine, something she had longed for. A few days later, Julia brought Mrs. Josephine home. As they entered, Nora rushed over, her eyes sparkling with joy, displaying childlike curiosity. "Mum, who's that lady?" Nora asked sweetly. Julia kneeled down and tenderly explained, "This is Mrs. Josephine, the lady I told you about. She'll be staying with us from now on." Nora's smile widened as she reached out to hold Mrs. Josephine's hand. "Hello, Mrs. Josephine, I'm Nora." Josephine looked at Nora, her eyes brimming with affection. "Hello, Nora. I'm very happy to be here with your family." Julia and Peter exchanged glances, happiness swelling in their hearts at the sight of Mrs. Josephine gradually discovering joy in life again. With Julia and Peter's support, as well as the love from their family, Mrs. Josephine began to regain her confidence and faith in life. In the days that followed, Julia and Peter continued helping Mrs. Josephine resolve her legal issues with Adrian, ensuring she would receive justice, all while providing her with a loving home where she no longer needed to fear. As weeks passed, Mrs. Josephine's life stabilized, and a smile slowly returned to her face. Julia and Peter devoted time caring for her, while Nora became close to her, often sticking to her side like a true granddaughter. One morning, as Julia and Mrs. Josephine relaxed outside in the yard, basking in sunlight filtering through the trees, Julia smiled gently. "Mrs. Josephine, do you feel comfortable here?" The elderly woman nodded, her eyes sparkling with joy and gratitude. "I truly feel at peace." "Thank you, Julia. Because of you, I no longer have to live in fear." Julia held her hand, deeply satisfied. Witnessing Mrs. Josephine attain the peace she so genuinely deserved. Yet the legal proceedings with Adrian continued, and Julia understood the importance of ensuring Josephine's long-term safety. That day, Julia received a call from the officer overseeing Mrs. Josephine's case. She sat down beside her, handing over the phone so she could receive the news directly. "Hello, Mrs. Josephine. This is regarding your case," the officer began. "We have good news. After thorough investigation and sufficient evidence, we have issued an arrest warrant for Adrian on charges of abuse and abandonment of an elderly person." Mrs. Josephine sat silent, her eyes teeming with both surprise and relief. Julia grasped her hand, joy surging through her upon knowing Mrs. Josephine would finally receive justice. "We assure you we'll do our utmost to ensure Adrian faces the law. You don't need to worry any longer," the officer added. When the call ended, Mrs. Josephine's eyes overflowed with tears. "I never imagined I'd see the day I'd get justice. I once thought I would endure in silence, but now, things are different." Julia smiled softly, patting her shoulder. "You deserve this, Mrs. Josephine. From now on, you'll never have to live in fear again." Hearing the good news, Peter couldn't contain his joy. He joined Mrs. Josephine, a hand placed on her shoulder. "Not only do you have justice, but you also have a family. We will always be here to protect you." Mrs. Josephine looked at Julia, Peter, and little Nora playing nearby. Emotion surged through her heart as she replied, "You're my family. I don't know what to say other than thank you." Suddenly Nora dashed over, grasping Mrs. Josephine's hand innocently. "Mrs. Josephine, are you happy?" "I'm very happy you're here." Mrs. Josephine responded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Thank you for bringing back the happiness I thought I had lost long ago." In the subsequent days, Julia's family showered Mrs. Josephine with love and care. They organized warm meals, exchanged stories, and infused their home with laughter and warmth. Julia and Peter did everything within their power to help Josephine regain her trust in life, ensuring she felt genuinely part of their family. One evening, as Julia and Mrs. Josephine sat together, the elderly woman spoke hesitantly. "Julia, I know I've been a burden on you and your family, but I'm so grateful for all you've done." Julia took her hand, her gaze filled with love. "Mrs. Josephine, you're not a burden. Family is about loving and supporting one another. We're grateful to have you in our lives." Mrs. Josephine smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Thank you, Julia. I never thought I'd be this blessed." Julia looked at her, her heart brimmed with joy. "Mrs. Josephine, from now on, live for your own happiness. We'll create beautiful memories together, and you never have to worry again." Both laughed, and Julia felt as if all pain and worry evaporated. Mrs. Josephine wasn't a lonely, mistreated elderly woman anymore. She was part of a complete family, loved and cared for. Peter joined them, sitting beside the two women. "From now on, please consider this house your home. We'll all live happily together." Nora ran over, laughing innocently. "I really like Mrs. Josephine. Will she stay here forever?" Julia and Peter exchanged glances, both smiling as they nodded. "Yes, Nora, Mrs. Josephine will stay here with us, and we'll all live together in happiness." Holding Nora's hand, Mrs. Josephine's eyes sparkled with joy. It had been far too long since she felt such peace and completeness. Julia and Peter provided not just the protection and justice she longed for, but also the love and warmth of a real family. The story of Mrs. Josephine illustrates not only the pain of a person abandoned, but serves as a profound lesson about compassion, patience, and our human responsibility to protect one another. Through Julia's experiences, we see clearly the risks of rumors and unfounded assumptions that can obscure the truth. Leaving those in need to suffer in silence, Julia showed that patience and determination in pursuit of truth can save a life, while also shedding light on a heart-wrenching story, a life steeped in sorrow and longing for protection. Initially, Julia and her family perceived the strange noises, foul smells, and suspicious signs around the trash bin as mere oddities, perhaps products of imagination or even local gossip. At times, they felt frightened, intimidated by the notion that something sinister lingered in the area. Such thoughts resonate with familiar notions we encounter in daily life. Rumors and fears often arise from ignorance and uncertainty. The whispered tales and invisible fears, magnified by imagination, prevent many from approaching the trash bin, unintentionally overlooking a someone desperately in need, overlooked by baseless fear, which caused many to forget that strange signs may not always be omens of doom or things to avoid. In reality, these signs may indicate pleas for help from someone abandoned, lonely, and in urgent need of assistance. Julia didn't allow rumors or fear to sway her resolve. She listened to her heart and trusted her authentic feelings regarding the trash bin, choosing to clarify the truth rather than yield to surrounding tales. This teaches us that sometimes we must prioritize compassion and understanding above fear or vague prejudices imposed by society. We need to be more aware of whether someone right before us may require assistance. The story also imparts lessons about sensitivity and patience. Children like Nora may struggle to articulate their feelings, but possess a keen sense of the unusual around them. Instead of disregarding Nora's reactions, Julia chose to listen and observe, ultimately unveiling the truth. This illustrates that no sign, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, should be overlooked. Emotions and responses of those surrounding Using the youngest can provide crucial clues in identifying dangerous situations or someone in need of help. Julia's sensitivity and determination to help Mrs. Josephine remind us that sometimes, to save someone, we must rise above our own fears and prejudices. Had Julia and Peter blindly heeded the rumors without further investigation, Mrs. Josephine might have languished in loneliness and abuse with no hope of escape. Julia and her family's decision to take her in exemplifies the significance of compassion and supporting family in creating safe environments, aiding others in regaining trust and happiness. Mrs. Josephine's tale also serves as a chilling reminder that human neglect can drive others into despair. Her son Adrian not only abandoned her, but actively stripped her of her right to live peacefully out of sheer greed and selfishness. Adrian's actions led to Mrs. Josephine's tragic plight, yet through Julia and her family's patience and determination, justice was ultimately served, and Adrian faced legal consequences for his actions. This underscores that no one is above the law and highlights the essential nature of compassion in safeguarding the vulnerable. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support drives us to continue delivering heartwarming stories frequently. We are incredibly grateful for your support, and we look forward to seeing you soon.